The Radio from Black Pine Road, Part 1. My name is Daniel, and this happened 3 years ago when I was 31. I've always liked being alone, not because I hated people or anything like that. I just enjoyed quiet places. The older I got, the more crowded cities felt. Every street was packed, every store had people everywhere, and every day felt rushed. That's why I started taking long road trips. I would load camping gear into my truck, pick a random destination somewhere in the western United States, and drive. Sometimes I stayed in campgrounds. Sometimes I stayed in cheap roadside motels. But my favorite places were the remote ones. The forgotten places. The places nobody else wanted to go. That trip started in Idaho. My plan was simple. Spend 2 weeks driving through Oregon and Washington before returning home. For the first 6 days everything went perfectly. I found beautiful lakes, empty mountain roads, tiny towns with old diners, the kind of trip that makes you forget the rest of the world exists. Then I found Black Pine Road. I saw it on an old paper map I bought at a gas station. Most people use GPS these days. I do too, but I always liked carrying maps. There was something satisfying about unfolding them and tracing routes with your finger. Black Pine Road wasn't marked as a major road. It wasn't even paved. Just a thin gray line disappearing through a national forest in eastern Oregon. Next to it was a tiny symbol indicating an abandoned ranger station. That immediately caught my attention. I liked exploring old places, so the next morning I left the highway and followed the dirt road into the forest. The deeper I drove, the stranger it felt. The trees were massive. Tall pines crowded both sides of the road. After 20 miles I hadn't seen another vehicle. Not one. No cabins. No campsites. Nothing. Just endless forest. Eventually I reached a clearing. The ranger station stood there. Or at least what was left of it. The building looked ancient. Paint peeled from the walls. Most windows were boarded shut. The roof sagged in several places. It looked like nobody had touched it in decades. A rusted sign near the entrance had almost completely faded away. I parked nearby and walked around. Everything felt abandoned. Silent. Dead. The only sound was wind moving through the trees. I spent about an hour exploring before deciding to camp nearby. There was plenty of flat ground. No signs prohibiting camping. And honestly, it seemed like a perfect place. By sunset I had my tent set up. I cooked dinner over a small fire and watched darkness settle over the forest. That's when I noticed the radio. It sat inside the ranger station. An old desk radio. The kind from the 1970s. I hadn't paid much attention to it earlier, but now I could see it through one of the broken windows. For some reason I felt curious. So I grabbed my flashlight and went back inside. The radio was covered in dust. There was no power connected. The electrical wiring in the building had long since fallen apart. Still, I picked it up. The thing was surprisingly heavy. I turned the dial. Nothing happened. Of course not. There was no electricity. I laughed at myself. Then I set it back down and returned to camp. Around midnight I woke up. At first I wasn't sure why. Everything seemed normal. The forest was quiet. My tent was intact. Nothing appeared wrong. Then I heard it. Static. A faint crackling noise. At first I thought I was imagining it. But then I heard it again. Static. Coming from somewhere outside. I unzipped the tent. The sound immediately became clearer. It was coming from the ranger station. My stomach tightened. The radio. I stared toward the building. A pale light glowed through one of the windows. For several seconds I simply sat there, confused. The radio shouldn't have been working. There was no power, no generator, nothing. Yet the static continued. I considered ignoring it. Maybe some battery still worked. Maybe there was an explanation. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the building. The static grew louder. Inside the station, the radio sat exactly where I'd left it. Except now it was on. A weak yellow light illuminated the dial. The speaker hissed with static. I crouched beside it. The thing looked ancient. There was no battery compartment. No visible power source. Nothing. The hairs on my arms stood up. Then a voice emerged through the static. "Can anyone hear me?" I froze. The voice sounded distant, like someone speaking through miles of interference. "Please respond." Static swallowed the rest. I leaned closer. The voice returned. "I'm at Station 4. Please send help." Then silence. The radio went dead. The yellow light vanished. Everything became quiet again. I stared at it for nearly a minute. Nothing happened. Finally I returned to my tent. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning I convinced myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe some old battery hidden inside. Maybe I had been half asleep. Either way, I decided not to think about it. After breakfast I packed up and prepared to leave. But before getting into my truck, I took one last walk around the ranger station. That's when I found the journal. It was hidden inside a desk drawer. The leather cover had nearly rotted away. Most pages were unreadable, but a few entries remained. The final entry was dated October 14, 1987. It read, "Radio calls again tonight. Station 4 keeps requesting help. No such station exists. I've checked every map. The voice sounds different now, closer. I think it knows my name." I read the entry 3 times. Then I laughed nervously. Someone had obviously written it as a joke. At least that's what I told myself. Still, I slipped the journal into my backpack. Something about it bothered me. I drove away shortly afterward. For nearly an hour everything was normal. Then my truck radio crackled. I glanced at it. Static. The station I was listening to disappeared. Nothing unusual there. Mountain roads often interfered with reception. Then a voice emerged. "Can anyone hear me?" My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The exact same voice. The exact same words. "Please respond." I switched the radio off. The voice vanished immediately. A chill ran through me. I told myself it was coincidence. Nothing more. But when I looked into the rearview mirror, I noticed something strange. A vehicle behind me. An old Forest Service truck. Dark green. Rust covering most of the body. I hadn't seen it before. The road behind me stretched straight for almost a mile. No side roads. No intersections. Yet somehow the truck was there, following me. At first I wasn't concerned. Maybe another ranger. Maybe another camper. But after 15 minutes it remained the same distance behind me. Never getting closer. Never falling back. Just there, watching. The road twisted through dense forest. Every time I checked the mirror, the truck remained. Finally I reached a fork in the road. I turned left. The truck turned left. My pulse quickened. I sped up. The truck matched my speed. I slowed down. So did it. For the next 20 minutes it stayed behind me. Then suddenly, around a sharp bend, it disappeared. Gone. Completely gone. There was nowhere it could have turned. No roads. No trails. Nothing. Yet it vanished. I pulled over. Got out. Looked everywhere. No sign of the vehicle. Only endless forest. I stood there listening. The woods felt wrong. Too quiet. Then somewhere far away, deep among the trees, a radio crackled. A voice whispered through static. And this time, it said my name. Daniel. I immediately got back into the truck and drove away. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. Even then I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of Black Pine Road. And that was only the beginning. Because later that night, when I checked into a motel nearly 200 miles away, I discovered the journal wasn't in my backpack anymore. Instead, sitting on the bedside table beside the motel bed, was the old ranger station radio. The Last Visitor at Cedar Lake, Part 1. My name is Ethan, and this happened 4 years ago when I was 33. I've always preferred quiet places. Not the kind of quiet you find in a small town. I mean real quiet. The kind where you can stand outside at night and hear absolutely nothing except the wind. That's why I rented the cabin at Cedar Lake. I found it through a local listing while planning a week-long vacation in northern Washington. The photos looked perfect. A small wooden cabin, private dock, dense forest surrounding the lake, no nearby neighbors, no cell service. Exactly what I wanted. The owner warned me several times before I arrived. He said the place was extremely remote. The nearest town was nearly an hour away. If I forgot supplies, I was basically out of luck. I assured him that wouldn't be a problem. I packed enough food, water, batteries, and fuel for 2 weeks. I arrived on a cloudy afternoon in early October. The drive itself was unsettling. After leaving the highway, I spent almost 50 minutes on a narrow gravel road winding through thick forest. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of civilization remained. No houses, no power lines, no traffic, nothing, just trees, endless trees. When I finally reached Cedar Lake, I immediately understood why the owner loved the place. The water was perfectly still. Dark mountains surrounded the shoreline. The cabin sat alone on a small hill overlooking everything. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. The owner had left the key inside a lockbox. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The place was old but well maintained. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, small kitchen, wood stove, a few bookshelves, and a large window facing the lake. I spent the rest of the day unpacking. That night I sat on the dock watching the sunset. The lake reflected orange and red colors across its surface. For a while, it felt like paradise. Then darkness arrived, and everything changed. The silence became overwhelming. I've spent plenty of nights in remote places before, but this felt different. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No insects, no birds, no distant animal sounds, nothing, just silence. Around 10 o'clock I headed inside and locked the door. I watched a movie on my laptop before eventually going to bed. At some point during the night I woke up. I wasn't sure why. The room was dark. The cabin was quiet. Everything appeared normal. Then I heard it. A knock. 3 slow knocks. Coming from the front door. Knock, knock, knock. I sat upright. My heart immediately started racing. Nobody should have been out there. The nearest house was miles away. I checked the clock. 2:14 a.m. Another knock echoed through the cabin. Slow, patient, almost polite. I climbed out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. The knocking stopped. I walked carefully toward the living room. Every floorboard seemed impossibly loud. When I reached the front window, I peered outside. Nothing. No vehicles. No flashlights. No people. Only darkness. I waited several minutes. Still nothing. Eventually I convinced myself it had been a tree branch or some other harmless noise. I returned to bed. About 20 minutes later, the knocking started again. This time it came from the back door. 3 knocks. Exactly 3. Knock, knock, knock. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. I grabbed the flashlight and walked toward the kitchen. The back door contained a small glass window. I looked through it. Nobody. Nothing. Just darkness and the outline of trees. The knocking stopped. I stayed awake until sunrise. No further noises occurred. By morning I felt foolish. Lack of sleep can make everything seem worse. So I spent the day hiking around the lake. The weather was beautiful. Bright blue sky, cool air. Perfect conditions. Eventually the fear from the previous night faded, until I found the footprints. I noticed them along the shoreline near the dock. At first I assumed they were mine. Then I realized they weren't. These prints were barefoot, and they appeared fresh. The footprints emerged from the forest, walked along the shoreline, then stopped at the edge of the dock. There were no return tracks. I stared at them for a long time. The mud clearly showed human footprints, yet whoever made them had apparently vanished into the lake. That made no sense. I searched the surrounding area. Nothing. No camping equipment. No boats. No signs of another person. Just those footprints. For the rest of the day I couldn't stop thinking about them. As evening approached, clouds rolled across the mountains. By sunset rain began falling. The storm intensified quickly. Heavy wind rattled the cabin. Rain slammed against the windows. Lightning illuminated the forest every few seconds. I stayed inside reading a book. Around midnight the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness. I lit several lanterns and continued reading. Then I heard something outside. Footsteps. Slow footsteps moving across the porch. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound circled the cabin, moving from window to window. My pulse quickened. I stood and listened. The footsteps stopped directly outside the living room window. For several seconds there was silence. Then came 3 knocks. Not on the door, on the glass. Knock, knock, knock. I nearly dropped the lantern. The sound had come from less than 3 feet away. I forced myself to look. Lightning flashed across the lake. For an instant the entire room illuminated, and I saw a figure standing outside the window. A man, tall, thin, completely motionless. The next lightning flash came a second later. The figure was gone. I ran to the window. Nothing stood outside, only rain. The porch was empty. I locked every door again even though they were already locked. Then I sat in the bedroom holding a flashlight until morning. When daylight finally arrived, I went outside. The storm had passed. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. The mud beneath the living room window contained a single barefoot footprint. Just one. As if someone had stood there all night without moving. I packed my truck immediately. At that point I intended to leave, but when I inserted the key into the ignition, the engine wouldn't start. The battery was dead, completely dead. I couldn't understand it. The truck had worked perfectly yesterday. Now it wouldn't even turn over. I spent hours trying to fix the problem. Nothing worked. By afternoon I accepted reality. I was stuck, at least until I could hike to the main road and hopefully find help. As I unloaded supplies back into the cabin, I noticed something taped to the front door. A piece of paper. My stomach dropped. I was certain it hadn't been there earlier. With trembling hands I removed it. The note contained only 4 words. Thank you for staying. No signature. No explanation. Nothing else. I searched the entire property. Nobody was there. No footprints. No evidence. Just the note. That night I pushed a heavy table against the front door. I placed a chair beneath the doorknob. Every window remained locked. The cabin felt more like a prison than a vacation rental. Outside, darkness slowly consumed the forest. Around 11 o'clock the knocking returned. 3 knocks. Exactly 3. This time they came from the bedroom window. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. Another set of knocks followed. Closer, louder, then another, and another. Soon every side of the cabin echoed with knocking. Different windows, different walls, always 3 knocks, always patient, never rushed. As though several people were walking around the cabin together, I turned off every light. The noises continued, for nearly an hour. Then suddenly they stopped. The silence afterward felt even worse. I sat completely still, listening, waiting. Then I heard a voice, soft, barely audible, coming from directly outside the bedroom wall. A man's voice, calm, friendly. The voice said, "You're not the first visitor." A pause followed. Then, "And you won't be the last." I didn't sleep at all that night, and just before sunrise, I looked through the bedroom window one final time. Standing at the end of the dock was a tall figure staring directly at the cabin, motionless, watching, waiting. And when the morning fog rolled across Cedar Lake, the figure slowly disappeared into it. The Watchtower Beyond Hollow Creek, Part 1. My name is Ryan, and this happened in the fall of 2021 when I was 30 years old. At the time, I worked remotely as a graphic designer. The job paid well, and since I could work from anywhere with a laptop and an internet connection, I spent a lot of time traveling around the United States. Most people use their vacations to visit cities. I did the opposite. I searched for places as isolated as possible. Old forests, desert roads, abandoned mining towns, remote cabins. The more forgotten a place felt, the more I wanted to see it. That was how I ended up near Hollow Creek. I first heard about the area from an elderly man at a gas station in Montana. We got to talking while I was filling up my truck. When he learned I enjoyed exploring remote places, he mentioned an old fire watchtower deep inside a national forest. According to him, the tower had been abandoned for decades. Most people didn't even know it existed anymore. The location wasn't marked on modern maps. The old man drew directions on a napkin. Then he smiled and said something strange. "Just don't stay after dark." I laughed and asked why. The old man shrugged. "People who stay out there hear things." That was all he said. At the time I assumed he was joking. 3 days later I was driving through that exact forest. The road became narrower with every mile. Eventually pavement turned into gravel. Then gravel turned into dirt. After nearly 2 hours of driving, I reached the area marked on the napkin. A faded trail disappeared into the trees. No signs, no gates, no indications anyone used it anymore. I parked my truck and continued on foot. The forest felt ancient. Massive pine trees blocked much of the sunlight. The deeper I walked, the quieter everything became. Even birds seemed absent. After nearly an hour, I finally saw the watchtower. It stood above the trees on a rocky hill. The structure looked incredibly old. Rust covered the metal supports. Several windows were broken. The stairs creaked loudly in the wind. Still, it seemed stable enough. I climbed all the way to the top. The view was incredible. Miles and miles of untouched wilderness stretched in every direction. Not a single road, not a single building, just endless forest. Inside the watchtower room I found old furniture. A desk, several chairs, broken shelves, dust covered everything. The place looked abandoned exactly as the old man had described. I spent the afternoon exploring. The tower fascinated me. Eventually I decided to camp nearby. I found a flat clearing at the bottom of the hill and set up my tent. As sunset approached, the forest became increasingly quiet. The silence reminded me of being inside an empty church. Peaceful at first, then unsettling. By 9 o'clock darkness had completely swallowed the woods. I sat beside a small campfire eating dinner. That's when I noticed the light. At first I thought it was a star, a tiny white dot deep among the trees. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately, like someone carrying a flashlight. I watched for several minutes. The light drifted between the trees before eventually disappearing. The sight made me uneasy. Nobody should have been out there. Still, I convinced myself it was probably another camper. Eventually I crawled into my tent and went to sleep. A loud metallic bang woke me sometime after midnight. My eyes snapped open. For a moment I didn't know where I was. Then another bang echoed through the forest. The sound came from the watchtower. I grabbed my flashlight. Outside, the woods were pitch black. The tower stood silhouetted against the night sky. Another metallic crash echoed from above. Something was moving around inside. I stared at the structure. The light from my flashlight barely reached halfway up the stairs. The rational part of my brain told me it was probably the wind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The night was completely still. No wind, no rain, nothing. Then a light appeared inside the watchtower. A pale yellow glow. The exact kind of glow produced by an old lantern. I froze. Someone was up there. The light moved from one window to another, back and forth, as though a person were pacing inside. I considered calling out. Instead, I remained silent. After several minutes the light suddenly vanished. The tower became dark again. A few seconds later I heard footsteps. Metal footsteps, slowly descending the stairs. Clang, clang, clang. Every step echoed through the forest. My heart pounded. I aimed my flashlight toward the staircase. Nothing appeared, yet the footsteps continued. Closer, lower, one step at a time, until they reached the ground. Then silence. Absolute silence. I swept the flashlight across the clearing. Nothing. No person. No movement. No sound. Eventually I retreated into my tent. Sleep never returned. I spent the rest of the night listening, waiting. At sunrise I almost laughed at myself. Everything looked normal again. The tower stood empty. The forest seemed harmless. Part of me considered leaving. Instead, curiosity convinced me to stay one more day. That decision turned out to be a mistake. Later that morning I climbed back to the watchtower. Inside, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A notebook. It sat on the desk beneath a layer of dust. The cover looked decades old. Most pages were empty. The entries that remained were written by different people over many years. Tourists, hikers, hunters. Many simply signed their names. Then I reached the final pages. The handwriting changed dramatically. Messy, uneven, almost frantic. One entry read, "Someone climbed the tower last night." Another, "There are footsteps on the stairs every evening." Then, "I saw a lantern moving below the tree line." And finally, "If you hear knocking from beneath the tower, do not answer." I stared at the page. The date beside it was October 1994, almost 30 years old. A chill crawled down my spine. I closed the notebook. That should have been enough warning. I should have packed up and left. Instead, I stayed. Around sunset the weather changed. Thick fog rolled through the forest. Visibility dropped dramatically. The trees beyond 50 yards vanished behind a wall of white. The watchtower looked like a ghostly silhouette above the mist. Darkness arrived shortly afterward. I remained inside my tent. No campfire, no music, just silence. Then, at exactly 10:17 p.m., I heard a knock. Not on the tent, not on a tree. A knock coming from beneath the ground. 3 slow knocks. Thump, thump, thump. I sat upright. The sound came from the direction of the watchtower. Several seconds later it happened again. Thump, thump, thump. The notebook flashed through my mind. "If you hear knocking from beneath the tower, do not answer." I stayed completely still. The knocks continued every few minutes. Always 3, always slow, always from beneath the earth. Then they stopped. For nearly an hour everything remained quiet. And then I heard footsteps. Not near me, not near the tower. Far away, somewhere inside the fog. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound grew closer, slowly, steadily, as though someone was walking directly toward my campsite. I switched off my flashlight and listened. The footsteps continued, closer, 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 until they stopped just outside the tent. No breathing, no movement, just silence. I sat frozen for what felt like forever. Then a voice spoke. A calm male voice, right outside the tent. Only one sentence. I finally found the tower again. The voice sounded exhausted, relieved, almost emotional. Then the footsteps walked away, disappearing back into the fog. I didn't leave the tent until morning. And when sunlight finally returned, I discovered a single muddy footprint directly outside my tent entrance. The footprint looked old, strangely old, as though it had been left decades earlier. And that was when the real nightmare began.